The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Bad news should come on a Monday, when the week is already ruined, but Tuesday gave you just enough hope that it could still be a normal week, and then it took that hope and folded it into a crisp white envelope and slit it under your door while you were out trying to find work. I remember picking it up off the floor of my apartment in Hamilton, Ontario, turning it over in my hands before I even read it. The return address was enough. Royal Bank of Canada. I already knew what was inside. 48 hours. That's what the notice said. 48 hours to bring my account out of overdraft, or my pre-authorized rent payment would bounce, which would trigger the clause in my lease that my landlord had circled in red pen when I signed it 14 months earlier. I hadn't understood why he circled it then. I understood now. My name is Ben Wakefield, and until 8 months before that Tuesday, I had been doing fine. Not great. Not the kind of fine that lets you take vacations or buy furniture that doesn't come in a flat box, but fine in the way that matters most when you're 29 and living alone in a city that costs more every year. I had a job, I had a routine, and I had just enough left over at the end of each month to feel like I wasn't completely underwater. I worked as a dispatcher for a mid-sized courier company in the industrial end of the city. It wasn't the career I had imagined when I was studying logistics at Mohawk College, but it paid $18 an hour plus benefits, and I was good at it. I knew the drivers by name, knew the routes better than the GPS did, knew how to keep things moving when 3 deliveries ran late at once. My manager, Carol, had told me twice that I was being considered for a team lead position. I had started to believe her. Then the company was bought out by a logistics firm based in Calgary that specialized in what their press release called operational streamlining. I learned what that meant in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. They were consolidating dispatch operations to a centralized hub out west. My position, along with 22 others in Hamilton, was being eliminated. Effective in 6 weeks. We were each handed a package with a number on it that seemed reasonable until you tried to divide it by the number of months it would actually take to find something else. 6 weeks went by faster than any 6 weeks I had ever lived through. Then the real 6 weeks started. The ones where you send out 40 applications and hear back from 4, where you wake up at 6:30 even though you have nowhere to be, where you start calculating exactly how many days until things get genuinely bad. I gave myself a budget, and then I blew the budget. I gave myself a new budget. I told myself I would stop checking my account balance every morning because it only made the anxiety worse, and then I checked it every morning because not knowing felt worse than knowing. I applied to everything I was qualified for and some things I wasn't. I told myself I had done everything right, gone to school, stayed out of trouble, paid my taxes, built up a modest savings, and that things would work out because people who do everything right don't just fall off a cliff. But they do. That's the part nobody tells you until it's happening to you. By the time that RBC envelope landed on my floor, I had been out of work for nearly 5 months. My savings were gone. My overdraft protection was gone. I had borrowed $700 from my younger sister, who could not afford to lend it, and I had told her I would pay her back by the end of the month, and I had not. The only reason I still had my car was that I had made the final payment 18 months ago. The only reason I still had my apartment was that I had paid 2 months of rent at once back in the spring, before things got bad, and that buffer had just now run out, 48 hours. If you've ever received a notice like that, if ever stood in a doorway holding a piece of paper that tells you exactly how much time you have left before the floor falls out, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Honor Stories. Because the thing about moments like that is that they feel completely private and completely humiliating. And the truth is, they happen to more people than anyone ever admits. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time that evening. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments get when you haven't had people over in a while. I had a half-empty bag of rice in the cupboard and some eggs and a jar of peanut butter that was almost done. I did the math on my phone. I owed my sister $700. I owed my landlord, Philip, the next month's rent plus a late fee. My car insurance was coming out in 9 days. I made a list and then I stopped making the list because the list was making me feel sick. I was 29 years old and I did not know how I was going to afford breakfast on Thursday. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a rough budget for a life that had fewer expenses, meaning a life where I did not have my apartment. I had no idea where I would go. My parents were in Brantford in a 2-bedroom house that already had my grandmother living in the second room. My sister had a 1-bedroom with her partner and their dog. I had a college friend in Guelph, but we hadn't spoken in almost a year, and reaching out to ask if I could sleep on his couch felt like the kind of ask that ends friendships. I wrote down numbers until the numbers stopped meaning anything, and then I went back to bed. The next morning I was standing at the kitchen counter, drinking instant coffee and staring out the window at the parking lot, when there was a knock at my door. It was the kind of knock that sounds like it isn't sure it wants to be heard. 2 taps, then 1 more. I almost didn't answer it. I assumed it was Philip, and I didn't know what I was going to say to Philip. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Philip. It was Irene Bouchard. Irene owned the building. Not just managed it, owned it, had owned it for more than 2 decades, having bought it in her early 40s after a long career in social work for the city of Hamilton. She was in her mid-60s now, with short white hair and the kind of steady, unhurried way of moving that makes you feel like whatever is happening can wait until she's ready to address it. I had met her twice before, once when I signed my lease and once when she came by to check on a heating issue in the fall. She had seemed sharp and fair and not particularly warm, which is about all you want from a landlord in my experience. She was holding a manila folder. I felt my stomach drop. I thought, she's going to hand me something. An official notice, something worse than the one from the bank. She looked at me for a moment, then passed me into the apartment, and I became suddenly aware of what she was seeing. The boxes I had started pulling out of the closet. The jacket hanging over the chair by the door, with the lining starting to fray. The general appearance of a space that belonged to someone who was running on empty. She asked if she could come in. I stepped back. She sat down at my kitchen table without being invited to, which should have felt presumptuous, but somehow didn't. She set the folder down but didn't open it. For a few seconds, she just looked at the window. Then she said she had been going through the building files and had come across the note Philip had made about the potential lease breach. She said she made it a point to look into these things personally before anything escalated. And then she said, "Tell me what happened." There's something about being asked a direct question by someone who is clearly going to wait for the actual answer that makes it impossible to give a short one. I had been telling people I was between jobs, working on some things for months. I had a whole set of phrases I used that were technically true and emotionally false. But sitting across from Irene Bouchard at my own kitchen table at 9 in the morning with a folder between us and a bank notice on the counter, I didn't have the energy for any of it. So I told her. The whole thing. The buyout. The package. The applications. The interviews that went nowhere. The math that stopped adding up. The call to my sister that I was still ashamed of. I told her about the budget I had written out at 2 in the morning and what it implied about where I would be sleeping in a month. I talked for probably 15 minutes without stopping. She didn't take notes. She didn't interrupt. She didn't make any of the faces people make when they're waiting for you to finish talking, so they can tell you what you should have done differently. When I was done, the room was quiet for long enough that I started to wonder if I'd said too much. Then, Irene nodded. Slowly, like something had confirmed itself. She told me she hadn't bought this building because it was a smart investment, though it had turned out to be one. She had bought it because she spent 20 years watching the city of Hamilton fail the same people over and over. Not out of cruelty, but out of systems that were built for average circumstances and had no room for the ones that weren't. She had wanted to do something smaller and more direct. She had wanted to own the room where the decision got made. And then she told me something she had never once mentioned in either of our previous conversations. Before she retired from the city, she had spent the last 4 years of her career developing a pilot program for workforce reintegration, not job training in the abstract sense, actual skill matching, connected to actual employers who had agreed to participate. The program had worked well enough that the city had kept a version of it running after she left, but the version the city ran was underfunded and slow and capped at 40 participants per year, which meant a waitlist measured in months. She had been thinking for the last year or so about whether there was a way to run something similar at a community level. Independent, lean festet. She had the contacts. She had some personal savings she was willing to put toward it. What she didn't have was the time to build it while also managing the building and her other properties, and she hadn't found the right person to help. She looked at me. She said she wasn't offering charity. She said she was offering a trade, If I was willing to work with her, really work, not as a volunteer putting in an hour a week, but as a genuine partner in building something from scratch, she would suspend the lease notice and cover my rent for 3 months. No interest, no formal repayment schedule, just 3 months of stability to get something built. I remember the exact feeling of that moment. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was something more like vertigo, the feeling you get when the ground you expected to hit isn't there. I had been bracing for impact for so long that the absence of it was disorienting. I asked her why me. I'm not sure I actually spoke those words out loud, but she answered them anyway. She said, "Because you know what it feels like to be in the intake chair. And that's not something I can train into someone." I won't pretend I said yes immediately with confidence and a firm handshake. What I actually did was ask her if I could have a few hours to think about it, which she agreed to without any apparent judgment. I spent most of those hours sitting on my bed staring at the wall and trying to figure out if there was a version of this that was a trap. There wasn't one that I could find. I called her back at 3:30 that afternoon and said I was in. What followed was unlike any period of my life before or since. We converted the ground floor storage room that Irene had been slowly clearing out for years into a workspace. We got a table from a Habitat for Humanity restore on Barton Street. We got 2 mismatched chairs from the same place. Irene bought a second-hand laptop and a whiteboard and a laminated map of Hamilton that we taped to the wall and started marking up with colored pins, green for employer contacts, blue for community organizations, red for gaps we hadn't filled yet. We called the program the Hamilton Relaunch Center. Irene had a list of employers she had worked with during the city program: manufacturing firms in the East End, trades companies, a couple of healthcare staffing agencies, a regional grocery chain that was always hiring and had a decent track record of promoting from within. I started making calls. Some of them went nowhere. Some of them went further than I expected. A woman named Christine, who ran HR for a mid-sized food processing company in Stony Creek, not only agreed to participate but offered to conduct mock interviews for anyone who wanted practice before applying to her company or anywhere else. A man named Roy, who had built a small electrical contracting business from nothing over 30 years, offered to host an information session about getting into the trades. A community legal clinic agreed to come in once a month and answer questions about tenant rights, employment standards, EI applications, and then people started showing up. The first person through the door was a man in his early 50s named Carl, who had worked at the same steel fabrication plant for 23 years and had been laid off 6 weeks ago and had never in his adult life written a resume. He sat down across from me at our second-hand table and handed me a piece of paper where he had written out his job history in point-form notes, in pencil, clearly having spent real time on it. That piece of paper nearly broke me. I helped him turn it into something he could actually send out, and then I connected him with Roy, who knew people in the trades who valued someone with Carl's kind of hands-on experience. Carl had 3 conversations the following week. There was a young woman named Preethi who had come to Canada from Mississauga. Well, originally from Chennai, then Mississauga, and had a degree in accounting that wasn't being recognized by the firms she was applying to. There was a recently separated father named Mark, who had been a stay-at-home parent for 6 years and had no idea how to explain that on a resume in a way that didn't get him filtered out. There was an older woman named Gail, who had left a job she'd been at for 12 years because of a supervisor who made her situation unbearable, and who felt so much shame about it that she had told almost no one, and who cried quietly for about 2 minutes and then straightened up and said, "Okay, what do we do first?" Every single person who sat down in that chair reminded me of a version of myself from 6 months earlier. The particular quality of their exhaustion, the way they held their shoulders, the effort they were making to seem like they were holding it together just fine. Something happened to me in those weeks that I don't know how to fully explain. I had spent months feeling like I was failing at the basic requirements of adult life, and then I was suddenly in a room where I was useful, where the things I knew, logistics, systems, how to navigate bureaucratic processes, how to stay calm when multiple things were going wrong at once, actually mattered to real people in real time. It didn't fix anything about my financial situation, but it changed the inside of my head in a way that being employed again, later, couldn't quite replicate. About 6 weeks into our operation, on a Wednesday afternoon when we had no appointment scheduled, I was reorganizing our employer contact files when a man arrived at the door who I didn't recognize. He introduced himself as Stuart Mackay, and he says Irene had told him to stop by. Stuart owned a regional logistics consultancy based in Burlington. He worked mostly with mid-sized companies that were trying to improve their supply chain operations. Exactly the industry I had spent 4 years learning at Mohawk and another 3 years applying in the field. We started talking, and I wasn't even really thinking about myself as a candidate for anything. I was in program builder mode, thinking about whether his company might be willing to partner with us. But somewhere in the middle of our conversation, the context shifted. He mentioned that he'd been trying to hire a logistics coordinator for 5 months and hadn't found the right person. He said most of the resumes received were either overqualified people who would leave in 6 months or underqualified people who would need a year of training. He said what he actually needed was someone with real dispatch experience and enough systems knowledge to talk intelligently with clients. I told him fairly quietly that I had spent 3 years doing exactly that before my company was bought out. Stuart looked at me for a long moment. He asked if I had time to come into his Burlington office that Friday. I remember the drive home afterward. The 403 west to Dundas Street, familiar road, the afternoon light the way it gets in November, low and golden and a little bit bleak. I had the window cracked even though it was cold because I needed the air. My hands were steady on the wheel. That struck me, the steadiness. For months my hands had had a slight tremor when I was anxious, which was always, and right now they were completely still. I got the job, full-time competitive salary, just over $60,000 to start, with a review at 6 months, benefits, a small but real chance of getting somewhere. I sat in the Restore parking lot on Barton Street after getting Stuart's call, not going anywhere, just sitting there with the engine off. It was almost dark. I called my sister and she cried in that specific way she has where she tries to stop herself but can't. I told her I would transfer the $700 as soon as my first paycheck cleared, and she told me she didn't care about the money, and I told her I did. The Hamilton Relaunch Center kept going after I started the new job. Irene hired a part-time coordinator named Beverly to keep the day-to-day running, and I came in on Saturday mornings, which I still do. The room that started as a storage space with a mismatched table and 2 chairs has expanded into 3 rooms on the ground floor. We have a standing arrangement with the legal clinic, a partnership with the Hamilton Public Library's digital literacy program, and a roster of about 40 employer contacts who actually pick up when we call. 17 months in, we've helped just under 400 people connect with employment or training opportunities. That number isn't as big as some programs, but I know a lot of those 400 people's names, and I know what they looked like when they sat down in that chair, and I know what their faces did when they left. Carl, the steel worker with the pencil resume, is now doing millwright work with a company in Ancaster. He sent me a photo on a Tuesday morning from inside a production facility, just his boots and a hard hat visible, and the caption said, "First day, 2 words. They were enough." Before we reach the end of this, I want to ask you something. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me about one time someone helped you when you didn't expect it. It doesn't have to be a big story. The small ones matter too. Someone is going to read your comment tonight who needs to be reminded that that kind of thing still happens. I think about that Tuesday a lot. The envelope on the floor, the specific quality of the silence in my apartment at 2 in the morning, the way the numbers stopped meaning anything after a while. I think about the knock at the door and the 2 taps and the pause, and the way Irene sat down at my table and waited for the whole answer. I don't know exactly what she saw when she looked at me that morning. I know what I looked like from the inside. Someone who had run out of moves and was very close to running out of time. But whatever she saw, she decided it was worth something. She decided I was worth something. And that decision, quiet, practical, offered without fanfare from a woman sitting at a second-hand table in a hallway apartment in Hamilton, started something that I am still living inside of. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need it today. Like the video, subscribe to Honor Stories, and leave a comment below. Because sometimes the moment that looks like the end of your options is actually the moment just before something else begins. And sometimes the person who sees that possibility first is a stranger who decides, for reasons you may never fully understand, to knock on your door.